He came from the land of sun and dust, a place where dreams were carved into stone and hearts were tested by fire. His name was Joaquín Murrieta, but before he became the Robin Hood of the West, he was just a young man chasing hope, a man who believed that hard work could build a new life. It was the year, but the world was changing fast. Word spread like wildfire. Gold has been found in California. Men from every corner of the earth packed their bags, left their homes, and rushed to the golden land. Among them was a young Joaquin, barely 20 years old. He left his small home in Sonora, Mexico, with his wife Rosita, full of dreams and love. They had nothing but a horse, a few tools, and a belief that in this new world, hard work could bring peace and prosperity. They arrived in California, a land glowing with promise but heavy with greed. The hills were filled with tents, shouting men, and shining gold dust that sparkled in the rivers. Joaquin and Rosita found a small place by the Stanislaus River where they started mining. For a while, life was good. The days were long and hot, but Joaquin didn't mind. Every night he looked at Rosita and said, "Soon we'll be rich. We'll buy land, build a house, and live free. But freedom is never free, especially for those who are different." Soon Joaquin learned that California wasn't the land of equal dreams. After the Mexican-American War, the land that once belonged to Mexico now flew the American flag. And for men like Joaquin, men with dark hair, brown skin, and accents, the gold fields were full of danger. Laws were passed to keep Mexicans away from mining claims. White miners called them foreigners and demanded taxes just to dig in the dirt. If they refused to pay, they were beaten, or worse. But Joaquin was proud. He worked hard, stayed quiet, and tried to live with honor. He believed that justice would win, until the day it didn't. One evening, a group of miners came to Joaquin's camp. They accused him of stealing gold that he had mined himself. He tried to explain, but they didn't care. They dragged him out, tied his hands, and beat him until he fell. When Rosita screamed, they turned on her too. She cried for help, but none came. By morning, Joaquin's brother was dead, Rosita was gone, and his home was nothing but ashes. He stood there, bleeding and broken, looking at the smoke rising into the sky. Something inside him shattered that day. The man who came to California for peace died in that fire, and from those ashes, a legend was born. Joaquin disappeared. No one knew where he went or what he planned. Weeks turned to months, and whispers began to spread across the valleys. Stagecoaches were robbed. Rich miners were ambushed. Gold caravans vanished without a trace. Each time the story was the same: a masked rider, swift as the wind, striking like lightning, leaving behind a single sign, a letter J carved in the dirt. People began to whisper his name again. Murrieta, some said he was an outlaw. Some said he was a ghost, the spirit of revenge itself. But to the poor Mexican workers and families who lived under fear, Joaquin became something else entirely. A hero, a man who fought back when no one else dared. To them, he wasn't a killer. He was a voice for the voiceless, a blade of justice cutting through the cruelty of the West. But Joaquin didn't see himself as a hero or a villain. He saw himself as a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He once said to a friend, "If the law will not protect us, then I will." From the burned hills of the Stanislaus River to the dusty plains of Tulare, Joaquin's name began to echo across California. The newspapers called him the Mexican Bandit, but in the small adobe homes and cantinas of the poor, he was called something far different: El Patrio, the patriot, the man who fought for the people when the law failed them. And so begins the story of a man torn between justice and vengeance. A man who became a myth. A man whose legend would one day inspire the mask and sword of Zorro. This is the beginning of Joaquín Murrieta, the Robin Hood of the Wild West. Joaquín Murrieta vanished after the tragedy that destroyed his family. For months no one saw him. Rumors whispered through the mining camps that he had fled back to Mexico. Others claimed they saw him in the Sierra Nevada, wounded but alive, planning revenge. When he finally returned, he was not the same man. The gentle miner who once believed in peace was gone. In his place stood someone colder, sharper, and silent, his heart carved by loss and injustice. Joaquin had learned that in California, the law did not serve everyone equally. It served the men with pale faces and power. So he made a choice. If the law would not bring justice, he would become the law himself. He began small. At first he stole horses that had been taken from Mexican farmers. He returned them quietly to their rightful owners. Word spread fast. The poor began to whisper his name with hope instead of fear. Soon, others came to him, men who had lost everything to the same cruelty. They were miners, vaqueros, and drifters who had seen their families humiliated, their lands stolen, and their dreams crushed. 5 of them stood out, each carrying the same first name, Joaquin. There was Joaquín Murrieta, a silent man known for his steady hands. Joaquín Valenzuela, a bold rider who could disappear into the hills. Joaquín Botelier, clever with maps and escape routes. Joaquín Carrillo, the youngest, fiery and loyal to the core. And their leader, Joaquín Murrieta, the one they called El Patrio. Together they became known across the land as the 5 Joaquins. At first, their acts were quick and clean. A rich merchant would lose a wagon full of gold dust. A cruel sheriff would wake to find his horses gone. A mining company that cheated its Mexican workers would be ambushed on the road, its profits scattered among the poor. To the newspapers, they were criminals. To the ranchers who ruled California, they were demons on horseback. But to the people, they were heroes. Men who dared to fight back when everyone else stayed silent. When frightened mothers told their children bedtime stories, they ended not with monsters but with hope. Sleep, mi niño. Murrieta is out there. He will protect us. The 5 Joaquins rode like ghosts. They knew every canyon, every trail, and every watering hole between the San Joaquin Valley and the Mexican border. They struck fast and vanished faster. Their code was simple. Never harm the innocent. Take only from those who have taken from others. Leave no man behind. Even their enemies admitted they were disciplined and strange. They didn't drink during raids. They didn't fight among themselves. They spoke quietly and disappeared like mist before dawn. For every robbery the authorities reported, 10 others went untold, because the victims knew that Murrieta's men punished cruelty. Not honesty, but success brought danger. The more they struck, the more powerful their enemies became. Merchants joined with politicians and ranchers to demand action. Soon the governor of California signed an order. The band of Murrieta must be destroyed. The state offered a large reward, $5,000 for Joaquin's head. It was a fortune, enough to buy hundreds of acres of land, and men were willing to kill for it. That same year, a new force appeared, the California Rangers. They were veterans, hunters, and former soldiers, led by Captain Harry Love, a man known for his iron will. He was cold, disciplined, and determined to bring back proof of Murrieta's death. The chase began. The Rangers searched the valleys, questioned travelers, and followed broken tracks in the dust. But each time they thought they had him cornered, Murrieta slipped away. Some said he had friends in every town, people who would feed his men and hide them in barns. Others swore he could cross rivers at night without leaving a ripple. He became a shadow, part man, part myth. When frightened soldiers rode into Mexican camps asking questions, the locals would smile and say, "You're too late. Murrieta already passed through, yesterday or maybe tomorrow." Meanwhile, the legend grew. Ballads were sung in the cantinas. Paintings showed him on a black horse with a red scarf across his face. The stories changed with every telling, but the heart of the tale stayed the same. He stole from the rich. He helped the poor. He punished the cruel. Parents began naming their sons Joaquin. Children practiced signing the letter J in the dirt, dreaming they might one day ride beside him. Even some Americans, tired of corruption in their own towns, began to admire him secretly. They called him the Mexican Robin Hood. Yet for Murrieta, it was never about fame. Each raid was a memory, each victory a wound. He didn't smile when gold spilled from the wagons, or when his name filled the papers. He fought because he could not forget the fire that took everything from him. He often told his men, "We are not thieves. We are the echo of justice." But deep inside, he knew that justice built on blood never lasts forever. The more he fought, the closer danger came. His face appeared on posters. His bounty grew higher, and somewhere in the hills, Captain Love was tightening his circle. By 1853, the state called him the most wanted man in California. But for the 5 Joaquins, fear was already a part of life. They rode knowing every sunrise might be their last. Still, they pressed on, 5 men against an empire, because to stop would mean surrendering their souls. Joaquín Murrieta no longer dreamed of gold. He dreamed of freedom for a people who had none. And as the dust of their horses rose against the California sun, the legend of the 5 Joaquins spread farther than any bullet could reach. Their names were whispered with awe. Their cause became a cry for dignity, and somewhere deep in the desert, Joaquín Murrieta prepared for the fight that would decide his fate and seal his place in history forever. Joaquín Murrieta had become the face of rebellion in California. To the poor, he was a savior. To the powerful, he was a shadow that refused to die. By 1853, the government could no longer ignore his name. Merchants were frightened to travel. Ranchers armed their men. Stage lines lost money. The newspapers demanded justice, calling him the Terror of California. The state decided it needed a weapon, a force built to hunt one man. And so the California Rangers were born. The Rangers were not regular lawmen. They were former soldiers, gunfighters, and trackers. Men hardened by war, by desert heat, and by the silence of the frontier. At their head rode Captain Harry Love, a man as cold as steel. Love had once served with the U.S. Army Dragoons. He was known for his sharp aim and his sharper temper. He spoke little, trusted no one, and believed every legend had a weakness. The state gave him his mission: find Joaquín Murrieta. Bring proof of his death. The reward was $5,000, enough to buy land, a ranch, or a lifetime of whiskey. Love accepted without a word. While the Rangers prepared their hunt, Murrieta rode across the valleys with his band. He knew the hills better than any map. Every canyon, every creek, every cave, they were his allies. He moved his camp constantly. One night in the mountains, the next in the desert. He never stayed long enough to be trapped, but his men were growing tired. The raids had become harder. The gold was scarce. Some wanted to return to Mexico. Others dreamed of disappearing forever. Murrieta listened, silent as always. He understood their fear. He felt it too, a whisper in his chest every time he saddled his horse. Still, he could not stop. He believed their fight meant something. He believed that every strike against injustice was worth the danger. The Rangers followed the trail of rumor. They questioned travelers, bribed locals, and searched abandoned camps. They found burned wagons, footprints in the sand, and half-buried campfires, but each clue led them deeper into nowhere. The desert swallowed tracks. The wind erased signs. It was as if Murrieta himself was the wind, seen, heard, but never caught. Some rangers began to doubt he was even real. Maybe he's a ghost, one said. Harry Love only answered, ghosts leave bodies. In towns, stories of Murrieta grew larger. Some said he could ride 50 miles without stopping. Others said bullets could not touch him. Children played games pretending to be the brave Joaquin who robbed the rich. The authorities hated those stories most of all, because every tale made him harder to kill. To the miners who had once beaten him, Murrieta had become their greatest fear, the man who never forgot. To the people he defended, he had become their pride, proof that courage still lived in the land of gold. Late one summer night, the Rangers found a broken wagon near the Arroyo de Cantua. It carried fresh tracks, horses with shoes nailed in a Mexican style. Love studied the prints and nodded. "This is him," he said. They followed the trail for days, moving silently through heat and dust. They ate jerky, drank from creeks, and slept under their horses' shadows. The closer they came, the quieter they grew. Murrieta, meanwhile, rode with a small group of loyal men, Joaquin Valenzuela, a few trusted riders, and his half-brother Jesus. They believed they were safe for a while. They didn't know that the hunters were already behind them. At dawn one morning, a traveler ran into the Rangers and told them about a band of Mexicans camping nearby. He described their leader, young, strong, with a scar across his cheek. Love's eyes narrowed. "Joaquin," he whispered. The Rangers loaded their guns and rode hard. Dust rose behind them like smoke from a fire that couldn't be stopped. When they reached the camp, silence ruled the air. Only a few horses stood grazing. Love raised his hand, and the Rangers opened fire. Gunshots echoed through the valley. Men shouted in Spanish and English. One Ranger fell. 2 of Murrieta's riders were hit. The fight was fierce but short. When the smoke cleared, 2 bodies lay in the dirt. One had a bullet through his head. Another's arm was gone. Love stepped forward, his boots heavy with dust. He turned over the first body, a young man with a faint scar on his cheek and dark eyes now frozen in the sun. Love knelt beside him and said, "We've got him." They cut off the man's head and placed it in a jar of alcohol as proof. The second body's hand was taken too, the hand said to bear the mark of another Joaquin. The Rangers packed up and rode back to town. When they arrived, crowds gathered to see. They paid to look through the glass. Some turned away, sick. Others laughed and clapped, but many, especially those who had once called Murrieta a hero, stood silent. They whispered that it was not him. The scar was wrong. The face looked younger. Within weeks, new rumors spread that Murrieta still lived hiding in Mexico, planning his return. Harry Love ignored the rumors. He had his bounty, his proof, and his pride. But deep down, even he wondered, had he killed the man or only the myth? For the people, the answer didn't matter anymore, because legends don't need proof to live. Joaquín Murrieta had become something greater than flesh and bone. He had become a symbol of resistance, of vengeance, of hope. And though the Rangers rode home believing the hunt was over, the spirit of Joaquín Murrieta was just beginning its journey through history. The California Rangers returned to town as heroes. They rode in with their saddlebags heavy and their faces darkened by sun and dust. Captain Harry Love carried a jar filled with clear liquid. Inside it floated a severed head, pale, still, and silent. He claimed it was Joaquín Murrieta. Crowds gathered to see the trophy. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear, and a few out of secret grief. The Rangers set the jar on a table, charging people $1 to look. Miners lined up, whispering, "So this is the man who haunted the gold fields." But even as they stared, many shook their heads. "This isn't him," they said quietly. The scar was wrong. The features were softer. Some who had known Murrieta swore that the head belonged to another man. The newspapers, hungry for drama, printed the story anyway. "The bandit Joaquín Murrieta killed," the headlines cried. They described him as a villain, a murderer, a thief who had finally met his fate. They called the Rangers heroes and said justice had been done, but not everyone believed. In the mining camps and dusty towns, rumors grew like wildfire. A rancher swore he had seen Murrieta alive near the Mexican border. A traveler claimed he heard his voice in a cantina at night, whispering to friends. Others said they found fresh tracks marked with the letter J carved in the dirt beside them. It was as if death could not catch him, as if the spirit of Joaquín Murrieta had refused to rest. To the poor Mexican, families living under harsh laws, Murrieta's story became more than legend. It became hope. They sang corridos, songs of courage and defiance, telling how Joaquín fought for the people when no one else would. In those songs, he was not a bandit. He was a hero who robbed the rich, punished the cruel, and gave to the poor. Fathers told their sons, "Joaquín fought for our dignity." Mothers whispered to their daughters, "He was a man who would not bow," in their hearts. He became a symbol of pride, proof that even in a world built on injustice, one man could stand against it. Years passed. California grew wealthier, cities rose, and the gold rush faded into history. But the name Murrieta never faded. It lingered like a ghost on the lips of old men in saloons and in the songs sung by children under desert stars. Writers began to chase his story. Some called him a criminal, others a hero. In 1854, only a year after his supposed death, a man named John Rollin Ridge, the son of a Cherokee leader, wrote a book titled The Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murrieta. It was the first novel ever written by a Native American author. Ridge told Murrieta's story as that of a man driven to revenge by racism and tragedy, a man who became an outlaw not out of greed, but out of grief. His book spread across America and Mexico, making Murrieta's name famous once again. Readers wept for the man who had lost everything and fought back with courage and fire. Soon more writers followed. Murrieta's story traveled across borders, retold in plays, songs, and poems. In Mexico, he became a national folk hero, the man who defied foreign rule and stood for his people's pride. In California, he became a whisper, a reminder of the injustice buried beneath the gold. And then, decades later, his legend took on a new mask. A storyteller named Johnston McCulley created a character called Zorro, the masked avenger of old California, a man who fought for the weak and punished the corrupt. Zorro wore black, rode a fast horse, and left his mark, the letter Z slashed into wood and stone, but behind that mask was the same spirit that had once burned in Murrieta's heart. The same fire for justice, the same courage to fight alone against power. Zorro was born from the soul of Joaquín Murrieta, the outlaw who became immortal. Generations passed. The world changed. But each time injustice rose again, the story of Murrieta found new life. Historians tried to uncover the truth, to separate man from myth, but even they could not agree. Some said he was a noble rebel. Others insisted he was nothing more than a thief. But truth, like gold in the river, is hard to hold. What mattered most was the meaning his story carried. To some, Murrieta was a warning that anger can destroy even a good man. To others, he was a light, proof that courage can rise even from despair. In dusty museums, old jars labeled "The Head of Joaquín Murrieta" were displayed, though no one could prove they were real. Visitors stared at the relic and wondered what kind of man he truly was. A killer? A savior? Or simply a soul trapped between both worlds? No one knows for sure. But in the songs of Mexico and the legends of the West, his spirit still rides. Every time the wind crosses the valleys of California, it seems to whisper his name. Joaquín. Joaquín Murrieta, the outlaw who refused to die. The hero who refused to be forgotten. Even today, his story speaks to those who have been wronged, those who have been silenced, and those who still dream of justice. He reminds us that legends are not born. They are made from pain, courage, and the will to fight for something greater than oneself. Joaquín Murrieta began as a man, but he became a movement, a story too powerful for death to end. Years passed after the gold rush faded into memory. The camps where men once fought for gold grew silent, covered by grass and dust. Yet one name continued to echo through the valleys of California. Joaquín Murrieta. He was no longer just a man in stories. He had become a voice, a symbol, and a question whispered wherever injustice lived. In small villages and border towns, people still spoke of him as if he might ride past at any moment. Old men in worn sombreros told stories beside campfires. They said Murrieta never died, that he had returned to Mexico, gathered an army, and promised to come back when his people needed him again. Every version of his tale changed a little, but all carried the same heart, a man who refused to kneel before cruelty. In every retelling, Murrieta stood not for revenge, but for justice. In the decades that followed, the legend of Joaquín Murrieta became part of California's very soil. When new generations of Mexican workers came to pick fruit or build railroads, they heard his story and felt less alone. He had lived through humiliation like they did. He had fought back like they wished they could. His name gave them strength. They called him El Patrio, the Patriot, a man who belonged not to one land, but to every person who had been wronged. Historians argued over facts. They searched for records, letters, or anything that proved who he really was. But truth had already been replaced by legend. To the people, it didn't matter whether the head in the jar was his or not. What mattered was what he stood for, the courage to fight when the law failed. In that way, Joaquín Murrieta's justice became larger than revenge. He represented an idea that dignity cannot be taken by force, and that no man should live as a stranger in his own home. By the late 1800s, his name had crossed borders. In Mexico, poets wrote songs about him. In Chile and Argentina, traveling musicians sang his story to crowds who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. In the United States, newspapers couldn't decide whether to call him a murderer or a martyr. He had become both, a hero to some, a warning to others. But to history, he was proof that one person's story could outlive bullets, governments, and even time itself. As California changed, the people changed too. Ranches turned into cities, gold mines into farms, and dusty trails into railroads. But injustice didn't vanish. It only wore new faces. And each time it returned, Murrieta's spirit seemed to rise again. In the early 1900s, when workers protested for fair wages, murals of Joaquín appeared on walls. His eyes painted fierce and bright, staring out from brick buildings as if watching over those who carried his dream forward. For the poor and the proud, he became a reminder that the fight for fairness never truly ends. Teachers began telling his story in schools. Writers used his name as a symbol of freedom, and filmmakers, decades later, brought him to life again. riding across the screen with wind in his hair and fire in his heart. Even when they changed his name, his shadow remained. The masked avenger Zorro carried his legacy, the same fight, the same fire, the same mark left upon injustice. What Murrieta began with a blade of vengeance became a torch of hope passed through generations. Through every telling, his story asked the same question. What would you do if justice was stolen from you? Would you bow your head and accept your fate? Or would you rise as Joaquin did and write your name in the dust of history? That is why his story survives. Because it is not only about the past, it is about what lives inside every person who dares to stand against cruelty. Some say that at night, when the wind sweeps through the empty deserts of California, you can still hear the sound of hooves. A single rider cloaked in shadow moving across the hills. No law can catch him, no grave can hold him. He is not a ghost, he is an idea. The idea that no matter how powerful oppression may seem, courage will always rise from the ashes. That is Joaquín Murrieta's true legacy. Not his gold, not his guns, but his spirit. The spirit of justice. The belief that one man's fight for dignity can awaken the hearts of millions. Even now, more than a century later, his story continues to inspire books, songs, and films. But beyond the fame, beyond the myth, there remains the heart of a man who once dreamed of a better life and refused to let cruelty destroy it. In every tale of rebellion, in every hero who stands for the helpless, a part of Joaquín Murrieta rides again. And as long as stories are told and injustice exists, his shadow will never fade. Decades turned into generations, and still, the name Joaquín Murrieta refused to fade away. In every corner of California, his story was retold, sometimes whispered, sometimes sung, but never forgotten. He was no longer just a man who lived and died. He had become a myth, wrapped in mystery, courage, and fire. Writers tried to claim his story, bending it to fit their own version of truth. Some called him a ruthless killer who deserved his fate. Others painted him as a noble outlaw, a man forced into crime by cruelty and injustice. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. But stories are not born to be quiet, and the story of Joaquín Murrieta grew louder with time. In dusty theaters and town halls, traveling actors began performing plays based on his life. The crowds gasped as they watched the brave Joaquin fight for his people, challenge corrupt sheriffs, and ride into the night to escape capture. Each time the audience cheered for the hero, not the outlaw. For the poor and the proud, he was no longer a criminal. He was the man who stood up when no one else dared. His story became a mirror for every soul that had ever been stepped on by power. By the early 1900s, the legend had crossed oceans. In Mexico, poets and singers turned his life into corridos, ballads that carried the fire of rebellion in every note. In Spain, writers compared him to old heroes who fought tyranny centuries before. Even in Europe, people began to speak of the mysterious outlaw from California who fought for honor. And then, in 1919, a writer named Johnston McCulley gave Murrieta's legend a new face, a masked one. McCulley's story introduced Don Diego de la Vega, better known as Zorro, a nobleman by day. A masked avenger by night, Zorro defended the poor, humiliated corrupt officials, and carved his mark, a Z, wherever injustice ruled. The world had never seen a hero like him. But behind Zorro's mask lived the spirit of Joaquín Murrieta. The disguise, the sword, the mission, all came from the same fire that burned in the heart of the Sonoran outlaw. Zorro was the legend reborn, made safe for the world to admire. He fought with grace instead of rage, but his cause remained the same, justice for the powerless. The character exploded in popularity. Movies, books, and radio shows spread his story across continents. The masked rider on a black horse became a global symbol of courage. Children played with wooden swords pretending to be Zorro, never realizing they were playing as a man who had once truly lived. In Hollywood's bright lights, Murrieta's pain was softened into adventure. The loss, the violence, the blood, all replaced by charm and style. But even under the fiction, a truth remained. Without Joaquín Murrieta, there would be no Zorro, no masked defender of justice, no hero who fought not for gold, but for what was right. As the decades rolled on, each generation found a new way to tell his story. In the 1960s, Mexican filmmakers revived Murrieta as the Robin Hood of El Dorado. In the 1990s, Hollywood returned to him again through The Mask of Zorro, starring Antonio Banderas and Anthony Hopkins. The film told of two men, one older, one younger, both fighting for justice under the same name. It was fiction, but the spirit behind it was real. Audiences around the world fell in love with the tale, the bravery, the sacrifice, the masked hero who refused to bow to cruelty. Millions watched without realizing that they were witnessing the modern face of an old legend. The same story that began in the dirt and pain of the California gold rush. As Murrieta's myth grew, it became more than history. It became a symbol of identity. For many Mexican Americans, his name represented strength and pride in the face of injustice. He became an ancestor of courage, a reminder that the people who built the West were not only miners and soldiers, but dreamers, workers, and fighters who refused to be erased. In art, murals of Joaquin appeared, sometimes masked like Zorro, sometimes barefaced, eyes filled with sorrow and fire. In music, his name was sung beside those of revolutionaries and poets. And in every version, one thing remained unchanged. Murrieta stood for those who could not speak for themselves, but fame can twist truth. As his story passed from mouth to mouth, from book to screen, the line between the man and the myth grew thinner. Scholars still debate what really happened. Was he killed in 1853? Did he escape and live out his days in Mexico? Or was the legend born from the cries of a people who needed a hero? The answer may never be known, and perhaps it doesn't need to be. Because legends live longer than men. They carry what reality cannot, the dream of what could be. Today, when we see Zorro's black cape flutter in the wind, when we cheer for heroes who fight for the forgotten, we are still cheering for Joaquín Murrieta. He lives in every story where justice wears a mask. He lives in every voice that dares to speak against the powerful. The mask may change, the setting may change, but the soul behind it remains the same. Joaquín Murrieta, the outlaw who became a hero, and the hero who became a legend. As the legend of Joaquín Murrieta spread across borders and centuries, the line between truth and myth began to disappear. People knew his name, they sang his songs, they told his story, but few truly knew the man himself. Behind the legend of the masked hero and the outlaw avenger, there was still a real person, a miner, a husband, a dreamer. This part of his story, the forgotten truth, is the one most people never hear. In the beginning, Joaquín Murrieta was not an outlaw at all. He was just one of thousands who crossed the border from Sonora, Mexico, into California during the gold rush of 1849. He came with his young wife, Rosita, full of hope and ambition. They dreamed of owning a small piece of land, of building a life together in peace. For a short time, life seemed fair. They found gold near the Stanislaus River, worked hard, and saved what they could. But California, after the war between Mexico and the United States, was a place full of hatred and fear. To the new American settlers, men like Murrieta were not equals. They were seen as outsiders, even though they had lived on that land long before the American flag ever waved over it. The foreign miners' tax law made life impossible for many Mexican miners. They were forced to pay high fees just to dig for gold, while white miners mined for free. Those who refused were beaten or driven away. Joaquin tried to keep working, to ignore the insults, the slurs, the threats. But fate would not let him stay silent forever. One day, a group of miners accused him and his brother of stealing gold. No proof, no witnesses, only prejudice. When Murrieta protested, they attacked. His brother was lynched. His wife was assaulted and murdered. Joaquin himself was beaten nearly to death and left in the dirt. When he finally stood up again, the man who dreamed of peace was gone. In his place stood the man history would never forget. Historians believe that this moment, this act of cruelty, was the spark that lit the fire. From that day on, Joaquín Murrieta became an enemy of the system that had destroyed his world. He gathered men like him, men who had lost everything, and began his campaign of revenge. But here the facts blur. There were many men named Joaquin in California at the time. Over a dozen, according to official records. So many, in fact, that the government created a list called the 5 Joaquins. Each was accused of robbery, murder, or horse theft. One of them was Joaquín Murrieta. Another was Joaquín Valenzuela. Another, Joaquín Botella. Each man's crimes began to merge into one. The newspapers, hungry for stories, combined them all into a single villain. the perfect outlaw. The California Rangers, led by Captain Harry Love, were sent to stop the chaos. When they finally caught and killed a man they believed was Murrieta, they needed proof to claim the reward. So they cut off the man's head and preserved it in alcohol. That head was displayed for months, carried from town to town for people to see. But many eyewitnesses, including men who had known Murrieta personally, said the head was not his. They insisted the real Joaquin had escaped, fleeing south into Mexico, where he lived under a false name. No one ever proved who was right. There were no photographs, no fingerprints, no real evidence. Only stories, some written, others whispered. In time, the truth became buried under the weight of legend. The real Joaquín Murrieta disappeared, and in his place stood two versions of the same man, the bandit and the hero. Historians now say that both versions may hold some truth. He might have committed crimes, theft, robbery, maybe even killing. But those acts were born not from greed, but from vengeance and desperation. A man pushed too far will do anything to survive. To his enemies, Murrieta was a criminal who brought chaos. To his own people, he was a symbol of resistance, the first man to stand up and fight against injustice in the New California. The forgotten truth is that both sides were right. Murrieta was not an angel, and he was not a devil. He was human. A man caught between two worlds, Mexico and America, peace and violence, law and survival. He did what many could not. He refused to accept silence. He refused to bow down to the cruelty that had taken everything from him. And though the world labeled him a bandit, the people who shared his blood called him something else, a fighter. When historians study him now, they find little solid evidence and many contradictions. But perhaps that is the real power of Joaquín Murrieta's story. He cannot be fully known or captured, not by history, not by time, not by the law. He represents something larger, the spirit of a people who refuse to be erased. In the end, his story reminds us that history is written by those who survive, but legends are written by those who endure. And Joaquín Murrieta endures still, writing in songs, in stories, and in the hearts of those who still fight for justice. More than a century has passed since Joaquín Murrieta's horse last rode across the California plains. The mines are gone, the saloons are quiet, and the dusty trails he once followed are paved roads now. Yet somehow his story still breathes. It lives in books, in songs, in films, and in the hearts of people who have never stopped searching for justice. Because Joaquín Murrieta was never just a man. He was a feeling. The fire that burns in anyone who refuses to bow to unfairness. Long after his supposed death, his legend began to grow beyond the deserts and valleys of the Old West. People spoke his name in whispers and in music. Miners sang corridos about him, songs that kept his memory alive. In Mexico, ballads told of his courage and his pain. In the United States, storytellers passed down tales of the Robin Hood of California. Each version was different, but the message stayed the same. One man can make the world remember what justice means. As years turned into decades, historians tried to separate truth from myth. They searched for records, diaries, and eyewitness accounts. Some found hints that Murrieta had lived longer than people thought, that he had escaped California and returned quietly to Mexico. Others found nothing but stories told by those who needed to believe that justice could survive even after death. And maybe that's why his story endures, because it's not just about him. It's about every person who has ever been wronged and dared to dream of fighting back. In time, his legend became a bridge between cultures. To Americans, he was a symbol of rebellion against tyranny. To Mexicans, he was a son of the soil who refused to surrender his pride. To both, he was proof that courage belongs to no one nation. It belongs to the human heart. Artists began to paint his face. Musicians sang his name on stages across the world. His story appeared in novels, comic books, and documentaries. And each time, the old outlaw was reborn in a new way. Stronger, prouder, more alive than before. By the 20th century, Joaquín Murrieta had crossed from legend into immortality. When people marched for their rights, they carried banners with his image. When workers fought for fair pay, his name was shouted in protest. Murrieta had become more than a folk hero. He was a symbol of dignity itself. He represented those who refused to stay silent, He reminded people that history's greatest revolutions often begin not with armies, but with one person who decides that enough is enough. Even today, his story is not finished. In 2023, a television series titled The Head of Joaquín Murrieta brought his legend back to life. It reimagined the outlaw as both hero and survivor, a man torn between vengeance and redemption. The world watched, once again fascinated by the man who could not die. In classrooms, students still learn his name. In libraries, his story sits beside those of Buffalo Bill, Wyatt Earp, and Billy the Kid. But unlike them, Murrieta's story carries a deeper wound and a stronger heart. His was not just a fight for gold or fame. It was a fight for respect. A fight for every man and woman who had been told that their worth was less than someone else's. Some historians still question whether Murrieta ever truly existed. Was he one man or five? A miner, a murderer, or a myth? But those questions no longer matter, because his story is alive, and that is proof enough. Every time a film hero defends the helpless, every time a rebel rises against injustice, Murrieta rides again. He is the spark behind every masked savior, every outlaw who becomes a symbol of good. He lives in the courage to do what is right, even when the world calls it wrong. In California, there are still places that bear his name: Murrieta Canyon, Murrieta Road, and the city of Murrieta, California. People drive past these names every day, unaware that they come from a man who once fought to be seen as human. Time has changed the land, but the echo of his story still drifts through the valleys where he once rode. Some say that when the wind blows through the canyons at dusk, you can almost hear the gallop of a horse, steady, strong, and distant. Maybe it's only the wind, or maybe it's him. Joaquín Murrieta has become immortal, not because of what he stole or whom he fought, but because of what he represented: hope, courage, defiance. He showed that one man's story could cross borders, languages, and centuries, that even when the world tries to bury the truth, justice finds a way to rise again. The legend of the immortal outlaw isn't about death or revenge anymore. It's about what it means to live with honor, even when the world offers you none. And so, when people speak of him now, they don't just remember a bandit. They remember a voice, a promise, a spirit that refused to fade. Joaquín Murrieta, the man who became the legend, and the legend who became eternal. More than 170 years have passed since Joaquín Murrieta first rode across the wild hills of California. Empires have fallen, borders have shifted, and new generations have been born. Yet his name still stirs something deep within those who hear it. Not fear, but pride. Because over time, Joaquín Murrieta became more than a story. He became a symbol of resistance. For many, Murrieta represents the fight of the forgotten. He is the voice of those who work in silence, who are treated as invisible, who dream of fairness in a world that often feels unfair. In every era, people have looked to him and seen a reflection of themselves, a reminder that even one person can challenge injustice. When farm workers marched through California's fields in the 1960s, demanding fair wages and dignity, some carried banners of Murrieta. His image, painted with bold eyes and a determined jaw, stood beside that of modern leaders like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. To them, Murrieta was not a distant outlaw. He was a brother from the past, still marching beside them. They saw in him the same fire, the refusal to bow, the courage to stand, the belief that justice must be earned, not begged for. Artists and poets continued to keep his name alive. Murals of Joaquin appeared on city walls in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Tijuana, bright colors telling stories of hope and rebellion. Some painted him with a sombrero and a pistol, others with a mask and a sword like Zorro, but the message never changed. He stood for the poor, for the workers, for the people who built the West with their hands and sweat. In songs, his story became a chant of resistance. In classrooms, teachers told his story not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in dignity. And in every retelling, the question remained the same. What does justice mean when the system refuses to give it to you? For Chicano activists in the 1970s, Joaquín Murrieta was reborn as a hero of their movement. He became a cultural icon, a bridge between the history of Mexico and the identity of Mexican Americans. They called their movement El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, the spiritual plan of their homeland. And within that plan, Murrieta stood as one of their ancestors, the first to rise against oppression in the New World. He was no longer just a man from the past. He was a living spirit in their cause, a reminder that resistance has roots deeper than memory. The name Murrieta carried power. It appeared in plays, political speeches, and student rallies. When people spoke it aloud, it was not just history they were remembering. It was a promise that the fire of rebellion would never go out as long as injustice still lived. His story crossed language and culture. He became a figure of unity between people divided by borders. To some, he was a Mexican hero. To others, a Californian legend. But to all, he was proof that courage could not be conquered, even outside of politics. His image inspired countless works of art. Books, poems, and films continued to explore his life, each one searching for the man behind the myth. Writers described his heartbreak, his love for Rosita, and the pain that turned him from miner to avenger. Every creator saw something new in him, a man who stood against cruelty, but also one who struggled with his own anger. Through their words, Murrieta became a symbol of something deeper than rebellion. He became a reminder that justice is not perfect, and even heroes carry shadows. But the strength to rise after tragedy, that is what makes them immortal. In modern times, young people continue to discover his story. On social media, his quotes and portraits are shared alongside those of other historic heroes. Documentaries retell his life, not as a crime story, but as a human one. The story of a man who wanted peace but was forced into battle. When people speak his name now, they do so with respect. He is not worshipped. He is remembered as a man who stood up for dignity when the world gave him none. Some say that every nation needs its heroes, and every generation must find them again. For the people of the American Southwest, Joaquín Murrieta fills that space. The outlaw who fought not for gold, but for honor. He represents the spirit of standing tall when the world tries to bend you. The spirit that says, I may fall, but I will not break. And so his story continues, told by grandfathers to grandchildren, written in murals, sung in music, filmed in light. Because legends never truly die. They live as long as people need them. Today, when people face injustice, when they feel small against the weight of power, they can still look back and see Joaquín Murrieta riding across the horizon. Not as a ghost, but as a guide, a reminder that courage is timeless and that even a broken man can change history. He began as one person, but he became the heartbeat of resistance, proof that no matter how far time carries us, the fight for dignity never ends, and that is why, even now, the name Joaquín Murrieta still means something powerful, a symbol of rebellion, a voice for the voiceless, a spirit that will never surrender. Time has a way of erasing names, fading faces, and silencing voices, but some stories refuse to die. They cling to the wind, echo through generations, and live on in the hearts of those who still believe in justice. The story of Joaquín Murrieta is one of those stories. The man who began as a miner, a husband, and a dreamer became a symbol of everything the world tried to destroy: hope, dignity, and courage. He was broken, yet unbroken. He was hunted, yet never truly caught. He was killed, yet never truly gone. Across deserts and cities, across songs and films, his legend continues to move, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that even one person's cry for justice can outlive empires. In history books, Joaquín Murrieta's name still sparks debate. Was he a hero or a criminal? Was he a patriot or a thief? Did he fight for justice or for vengeance? The truth may never be known, but maybe that's what makes his story eternal. Because in the end, Murrieta's tale isn't just about what he did, it's about why he did it. He stood up when no one else would. He fought not because he loved violence, but because he had seen too much of it. He believed that even in a world that treated him as less, he could still stand as equal. And that belief, that stubborn, fearless belief, became stronger than any gun or gold. Over the years, his legend has ridden far beyond the wild hills of California. It has crossed oceans and languages, finding its place in the hearts of millions. In Mexico, he remains a folk hero, the man who avenged his people. In the United States, he is remembered as the Robin Hood of the West. And everywhere in between, he stands as proof that courage has no borders. When people march for freedom, his spirit walks with them. When artists paint the struggle of the poor, his eyes look out from the canvas. When a story of injustice is told, his shadow rides again, silent, steady, eternal. Even the places that bear his name tell his story. The city of Murrieta, California, stands today as a tribute to the man who once roamed those same lands. Few who live there may know his full story, but his name remains, carved into maps, roads, and hearts. It's as if the earth itself refused to forget him. As if the land he loved too much to abandon keeps whispering his name each time the wind sweeps through the hills. And what of the head in the jar? That gruesome trophy carried by the Rangers who claimed victory. It too became a legend. Displayed for years, then lost to time, leaving only questions. Was it really his? Or was it the head of another man, used to end a story the powerful wanted silenced? No one knows. But the answer hardly matters now, because while they tried to end a man, they accidentally gave birth to a myth. The more they tried to bury his name, the stronger it grew. They killed the body. The story lived on. Generations later, Hollywood brought him back to life. Each retelling, from dusty westerns to grand adventures, added something new to the legend. Sometimes he wore a mask. Sometimes he wielded a sword. Sometimes he fought with laughter instead of rage. But the heart behind it all was always the same. The belief that one person could stand up against injustice and inspire others to do the same. Every time Zorro raised his blade, every time a hero of the silver screen rode to defend the weak, Joaquín Murrieta rode with them, because he was the first to carve that path, the first to show that even in darkness, one person's courage can light a fire that never goes out. Today, his story continues to teach lessons that history often forgets. It tells us that justice is not always found in courts or laws. Sometimes it's born in the hearts of those who've been wronged. It reminds us that legends aren't created by power, but by pain, by purpose, and by the will to keep going when the world turns away. Murrieta's life began as a tragedy, but his legacy became a victory, not of gold or glory, but of spirit. In the end, he is not remembered for how he died, but for how he refused to disappear. Because every time someone stands up to oppression, every time someone fights for what is right, every time someone says, "I will not bow," Joaquín Murrieta lives again. He rides in the hearts of dreamers, rebels, and believers, across deserts, across time, across every injustice that dares to rise again. He is the whisper in the wind, the shadow under the burning sun, the legend that rides forever. Joaquín Murrieta, the outlaw who became immortal.